Well, this is video number 2 in looking at the menus and operation of the Canon Legria HF-G25, the Vixia HF-G20. In the previous video, I went through some of the setup menus, the kind of things you'll configure once and then leave. And in this video, I'm going to go through some of the shooting menus, the kind of functions that you will actually use while out and about while shooting. The first thing to note here is that I've got the lens cap closed, specifically so that you can see the on-screen displays more clearly. But I will open it in a bit so we can actually see a picture. First thing I'm going to do actually is switch the camera off and then on again, because it does show you some information when you actually power it up, although it's only on screen for a couple of seconds. So let's just switch it off, and there it goes, and switch it on again and watch for the very brief information that it tells you. It tells you you're in manual mode, the date, and importantly these two things at the bottom that have just vanished, that are how you have these buttons here configured, because that button and that button can be set up in the menu. So when you switch it on, it tells you how they're configured. In fact, I'm going to do that once more just so you can take that in once again, take the joy of the menus in once again. So on, manual mode, and assign button 1 and assign button 2 are set in the first case to auto manual focus, and in the second case not as it's labelled prereq. I've reconfigured that to change the stabilization mode, but we'll come to that. So let's just have a little look round the screen now. This is the camera as if it were ready to shoot, and let's have a look at what's on screen and what you can do. This photo button down here just lets you take a still photo. That's it, say no more. This button down here changes according to whatever the last thing you accessed in the menus was. So it becomes a shortcut for whatever you last changed. So if you want to change something, get back to it and change it again, this button will be the one you'll press. And you'll see as we go through the menus, that will change to whatever the last thing we changed was. I hope that made sense. And then going around the screen, it's telling us we're currently in manual focus. We can see here we're also in manual exposure because it's giving me the f-stop, the shutter speed, and how much gain is being applied. It's telling us we're recording in MXP, which is the top quality mode. We've got 2 hours 43 minutes of internal memory storage remaining. A good battery life, 322 minutes. I've got the big Duracell on the back of the Canon at the moment. We've got dynamic steady shot on. There are various modes of steady shot. There's standard, dynamic and powered, in increasing order of strength, for want of a better phrase. And by default I leave it on dynamic. It's paused, not actually recording. We're on clip number 30 on the internal memory, and then here the function button is the one that actually takes us through to the menus that you will use while shooting. Now you will notice for a start that 2 of them are greyed out and I can't operate them. That is because of the way I've got some of these other menus configured. For example, you can see in Rec Programs here an M, which stands for Manual Exposure, which is why I'm not able to alter these 2 buttons which relate to automatic exposure. Let's go into Rec Programs then and have a look at some of the settings we can change there. We've got the option of Programmed Auto Exposure, a Shutter Priority Exposure, Aperture Priority Exposure, Manual Exposure, and then some sort of scene modes, which are preset modes for things like on a beach, bright sunlight. It's the kind of thing you find in a stills camera. So programmed auto exposure is pretty much the camera doing auto exposure. It will change the iris, the gain and the shutter speed according to what it thinks is best to get the right exposure. I'm not a big fan of this because when you're filming TV, I want the shutter speed to remain a constant. The thing about shutter speeds is if you slow them down, the motion gets very blurry, which is great for a special effect, but not what you want in normal filming. If you speed the shutter up, the images become a bit too crisp and they look a bit staccato when you play them back on screen. And that's because you want a little bit of motion blur in video, but only so much. And that is why filming at 50 interlaced fields per second, 25 frames a second here in the UK, you want a shutter speed of 1/50th. In the USA, it's 1/60th. If you muck about with that, you start getting a sort of odd looking video. So programmed AE is not my favourite because it can change the shutter speed in that mode. So shutter priority mode then is quite good, because if you go into shutter priority mode, You tell it what shutter speed you want, and that locks it off at that, and then the camera will simply change the iris and the gain to get the exposure it wants. That is quite a good automatic mode if you're going to use automatic mode for exposure. The opposite, if you like, of that is aperture priority mode, where you say, well, I want the aperture fixed at this level, and you can see you just scroll through how much you want, and the camera will change the gain and the shutter to adjust the exposure. Well, I don't want my shutter mucked about with, so I would use shutter priority where I can fix it, or manual exposure where I have complete control over my iris, the f-stop here, the shutter speed and the gain. Now, in order to show you what's going on here, I'm actually going to open the lens cap and let's have a look. It's just some trees outside the house, and you can see here that iris is currently highlighted as f4, and I can change that down and make it down to f2.8 and very bright, and I can turn it down, and if I wanted to I could turn the iris down and turn the gain up, which would be an odd way of doing things because introducing gain means you're introducing electronic noise into the signal. So conventionally you would keep gain as low as you possibly can, open up the iris as much as you can till you get the exposure the way you want it. I mean, that's obviously way too bright. And at all times, as I say, I will leave my shutter speed firmly on 1/50th. Now, there are a couple of tools here to help you with your exposure, most noticeably the waveform monitor, WFM. And this is a sort of scan of the brightness of your picture, looking from left to right of picture. You get this scan of the brightness, and you'll see that as I make the f-stop darker, so we go down towards the darks at the bottom. As we make it brighter, the graph goes towards being bright at the top. And what this essentially means is you can look at this and instantly determine whether you think things are too bright. Now, that might look on the screen as if the exposure's right, and yeah, you can see it's sort of midway between black and bright, and it probably is about right. So this can show you, it can act as a guide as to whether your levels are sort of in the right ballpark. If the image you're looking at is mostly things that are dark, you would expect to see a lot of this green graph down towards the bottom. If you're pointing the camera towards the sky, you would expect to see a lot of the graph at the top where it's bright. The trick is to make sure that you don't have too much of all this green information above this top level here, because once you go above that, you are starting to, in fact, you can't see, let me move my finger a bit, above this top level here. Because once you go above that, as I have done here, and the sun's just come out, the information is clipping and you are losing detail in the highlights. And that information you cannot get back. It is better to make sure you adjust the exposure so that very little, if any, information is shown above that line, which isn't the very top line here, it's the one down from it. That is 100%. And then the line at the bottom here is 0. And you kind of want everything between 0 and 100%. But it's a very useful tool for setting your exposure, that, and you can just touch it to get rid of it again. The other one they provide you with is this zebras, currently set to 70%, and it means it's going to highlight on the screen anything that is reflecting light at about 70%. You can see in this image nothing, because you can't see. Oh yes, you can, just on this branch here. I don't know if you can see it. This branch here is showing a little bit of a zebra pattern. It might work better if I put my hand in front of the camera. No, it's not light enough. But this branch is reflecting at about 70%. I don't know if that's normal for a branch. What 70% is normal for is Caucasian white faces. So when you are trying to interview someone who is Caucasian, if their face is showing this little zebraing pattern, that's now disappeared off that branch because the sun's come out again, but this one's showing it over here, then you know that you have exposed them pretty much right. It's only a guide, and like all guides it can be fooled, but as a general guide it's quite useful. So I'll turn that back off again just for the moment. Anyway, that is manual exposure, and I hope that made some kind of sense, a really rapid run through exposure. And those are the modes. These portrait modes, by the way, are sort of the scene modes: portrait, night, beach, sunset. It's just the camera mucking about with all the settings, the white balance, the iris, the exposure, and so on and so forth. Again, I wouldn't tend to use those because it can muck about with my shutter. So I'll leave it on manual exposure. I think that's the way I like to shoot. So, other menus here then. White balance. I pretty much use automatic white balance. I find the auto white balance on most modern camcorders is fine. But if you think it's not fine and you'd actually like to say, well, we are in daylight here, yes, you can select it's daylight. And you can see there, it's just made the image a little bit sort of warmer when I've gone to a daylight setting instead of auto. You can tell it you're in shade. Oh, that's gone very warm, cloudy. Fluorescent lights, that's going to look a bit odd. And there's a lot of different presets here. And then two that you can set yourself, which you do by zooming in on something white so that it fills the screen and it's in the light that you're going to be filming on, and then you press that and you would press set. I mean, I need something white in front of the camera here rather than the actual daylight, but imagine that I have filled that with a sheet of white paper or something, and you would then say set white balance, and actually it's not doing a bad job there, is it? And it's telling us the light is at 5100K. Well, daylight's actually 5600 normally, so that's about right. And considering I didn't use white paper there, I'm quite impressed that the camera's done it correctly. For the most part, though, I'll pop it onto automatic. It does a pretty good job. Focusing, currently set to autofocus. I can toggle it here with my button that I've preset. To go to manual focus, you see the manual focus lights up there. And again, there are some tools to help us. Peaking here, if we switch that on, we'll put a little red line around anything that's in focus. And we can see here that pretty much all the trees are in focus, which is good. If I turn the focusing wheel so that it's not, you'll see that some of the nearer trees are not showing the red lines because they're out of focus. The further bits of branches are showing the red lines because they are in focus. And then as I turn the wheel some more, you'll see the nearer ones get the little red lines and the ones in the distance don't. So that peaking can just help you determine what bits of your image are in focus and what aren't. On the other hand, it can become a nuisance because it stays on the screen. So if you don't like your image looking like that, and it doesn't record it like that, but it's just on the screen like that, if you don't want that, go back in and turn it off. Now the other tool we get here is another little waveform monitor. This is an edge monitor, and the higher the green is up off the floor, if you like, the more of the image is in focus. So let me turn this so that it's changing the focus, and you'll see the amount of green is changing. There's everything out of focus, and there's no green off the bottom at all. If we turn it so that we're starting to go into focus, we get a bit of green going up towards the top. And basically, the more that's in focus, the more green there is towards the top. And that's just another useful little focusing aid. You can touch it to get rid of it, if you like. And then under this settings menu, we can decide whether we want peaking and black and white means the whole viewfinder will turn black and white while we're using peaking. It helps to sort of highlight that red edge around the things that are in focus if the image turns black and white. And you don't have to have red. You can choose blue or yellow if you prefer those colours. So that is your manual focusing. This set button here allows you to do a sort of camera-induced rack focus. So let's set it to be, you won't see it terribly well on this example, I'm afraid. Let's set it to focus in the far distance. And then we can say set. And then I think we can change it to be the nearer focus. And then we tell it to go on, and it will perform that little rack focus for us. If you see, I can't see I'll use that. I'd probably just turn the focus wheel myself, but it's there if you want it. Alright, what else have we got here? Backlight compensation, always on. That just makes the image a bit brighter to compensate for someone being silhouetted. Well, I'm using manual exposure for the most part, so backlight compensation on is switched to off. I'll just briefly change this exposure mode so that I can show you the AGC limit and exposure buttons here. AGC is auto gain control. It's how much gain the camera will put in when it's trying to expose something correctly. Now if the camera puts full gain in, the image can start to look grainy. So if you're filming in low light, in the darkness, and the camera just whacks up the gain, it can look really grainy. You may prefer to have a less well exposed image with less grain, in which case you can say to the camera, no, don't do it automatically, do it manually, and I will tell you what the maximum amount of gain to use is. And I have preset mine at 15 dB, because once you start going above that, you are putting in too much gain. So I'm going to leave that set to automatic, and it's even telling us now on the screen we have a 15 dB maximum gain plugged in. The other one here is the exposure adjust, which allows you to sort of adjust the camera's interpretation of what the exposure should be up and down a little bit, either by pressing on something in the image, and then you get this little adjustment dial here where you can go up and down by 2 or 3 points either way. Again, you have the option of the waveform monitor if you want to see that, and you can turn your zebras on if you want to see those as well. And that's just another way. Effectively, the camera has set the exposure, and then you just say, well, actually, I'd like a little bit more or a little bit less, rather than you either doing it manually or the camera doing it fully automatically. It's a halfway house, the exposure compensation. So there are many menus. Let us carry on. Audio scene is how you want the camera to record sound on the microphones, and it has sort of presets which change the way it digitally tweaks the sound when it records it. There's the standard mode, there's a music mode, there's a speech mode, and so on and so forth. To be perfectly honest, I'd rather leave it in standard, and again, if I want to process the audio afterwards, I will do it in the edit. But you do have this option, and theoretically each of these programs is slightly better suited to those styles of recording than the standard mode. The mic level, currently A for automatic, but you can change it to manual if you've plugged an external microphone in. I do not currently have an external microphone in there. If I did, I could switch that to manual and then set the level manually. What I can do is tell it to switch the audio levels on, and you can see now it's giving me this representation of, as I'm talking, the camera mics are picking up what I'm saying, and as we go back, that will now stay on screen. Since it's on automatic, you don't really need the level on screen while it's on auto, but if you have got it on manual, then obviously it's very helpful to have the little meter on screen, and you can see if you're blowing out the levels too much, if they're getting too loud. So that again was mic level. The zoom just gives you the option of zooming on your screen rather than using the control on the camera. I'd rather use the control on the camera personally. What else have we got here? The image stabilizer is very good. You can turn it off if you want to. If you're trying to do pans and tilts and things, sometimes it can be worth turning the image stabilizer off, because as you move the camera, obviously the image stabilization tries to stabilize the image, and the two end up fighting each other, your movement and the stabilization. So if you're trying to do certain types of moves, it can be worth turning it off. Otherwise, you have the options of dynamic and standard. They're just different levels of stabilization. But what you additionally have, you can see that D, by the way, there means we're in dynamic mode here, and that stays on screen at all time. But you also have this option of powered stabilization, which I'll just press my preset button here and it goes to a P. And when you are hand holding the camera just dead still, but hand holding it, and you want it to be as rock solid as it can without doing any pans or tilts or moves, that powered stabilization is extraordinarily good. But don't try and move the camera, because then it really does fight with you trying to move it, and the image gets a little bit jerky until it realizes you're trying to move it. But when you're just trying to hold still while you look at something, that is an excellent mode to have. Now, of the last few menus that are coming up here and in the next set below, the only one I'm going to talk about very briefly is image effects, because it does allow you to slightly change the look of the footage. You can change the color depth, the sharpness, contrast and brightness, just up or down a few steps each one, to just slightly configure the look of the image to how you might want it. Again, these are the kind of things you can sort of do in an edit, but if you don't like the out-of-the-box setting, then you can change the way the camera is recording. And this will apply to all the images it records if you have that set on, or you can just turn it off completely if you don't want to do any enhancement. In fact, I probably won't. I'll do it in the edit, so I'll leave that switched off. And then we have faders. Well, this is just, the camera fading to black and fading back in again. It's the kind of stuff you do in an edit. It doesn't need to be in the camera. And these are nonsense. Decoration allows you to scribble on the screen with like crayon drawings and things. Video snapshot is like the Twitter's Vine application. It takes a few seconds of video and stops, and then you press it again, it takes a few more seconds and stops, and then eventually stitches all those little snapshots together into one video. It's the kind of stuff you do in the edit. It does not need to be in the camera. These are gimmicks, as far as I'm concerned, that obviously might be well applicable in Canon's lower end cameras, but in this top of the range model that is tend to be bought by someone who is interested in video and editing, I really don't think these even need to be there. And Story Creator is the camera telling you what shots to film to create a story, which again, really, if you've got this camcorder, you probably know what you're doing and you don't need that. Review recording, possibly useful, possibly not. It plays the last 4 seconds of the last recording you made without you having to switch the camera back into playback mode. But as it's only the last 4 seconds and it plays it back without sound, it's pretty pointless. So there you go. Those are the menus. This was a very long video and I apologise for that. It's just of necessity because there is so much you can set in the camera. I hope it made sense. If it didn't, please ask me a question. Very happy to help. Put it in the comments below and I will do my best to help you out. Thank you very much for watching.